All right. Hey, good evening, everybody. Of course, we're here back for our Tuesday evening class, going through the historical books of the Old Testament, Joshua through the book of Esther. This afternoon, we're considering the book of 1 Samuel. And as you can already tell, I'm not with you live. Actually, right now, as you're watching this, I am at a conference in South Africa, just outside of Cape Town. So I appreciate your prayers. I'll be coming back later this week, and I'll be here and ready for Sunday. But this conference is a pretty wonderful deal to be at, and so I just appreciate your prayers. It's a strategic place in Africa, and we're meeting with people not only from the Calvary Chapel there in Cape Town, but there's several Calvary Chapels in South Africa, and then from the southern section of Africa as well. So appreciate your prayers. But tonight we got a lot to get into with our class, starting this section here in talking about the book of 1 Samuel. So when we talk about the book of 1 Samuel, we have to consider a few things. First of all, let's just kind of get the overview of it. We're talking about a book that takes 41 chapters and 810 verses. It's named the book of 1 Samuel because it begins with the prophet Samuel as the prominent figure. Now, this might strike you as just a little bit strange, and in fact, it is just a little bit strange. We have two books, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Well, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, Samuel is only alive for about the first half of 1 Samuel. Samuel doesn't appear in 2 Samuel at all, yet we call it the book of 2 Samuel. Well, there's some reasons for that. Originally, the book was a unified whole. We'll talk about it in a few moments, but later it was split by people working with Bible editions to make it in multiple books. But it's named 1 Samuel because it begins with the prophet Samuel being the prominent figure. Really what it records is the transition from the rule of the judges to the rule of the kings in Israel. And that's a very important transition. In a previous class, when we took a look at the book of Judges, we saw that the judges encompass this period of about 350 years from the time of the death of Joshua, lasting all the way to the establishment of the first king, Saul, which happens in the book of 1 Samuel. So what 1 Samuel is really all about is these transitions. The transition, first of all, from the period of the rule by the judges, and Samuel being the last judge over Israel, unto the rule of the first king. And then we also see another sort of transition. We see a transition from Saul unto David. Even though when the book of 1 Samuel ends, David is not yet recognized as king over the tribes of Israel, yet Saul is dead by the end of 1 Samuel, and David's kingship is imminent. It's just on the way. The main figures of the book are three individuals that I just mentioned, the figures of Samuel, Saul, and David. These three figures encompass most of the text, most of the focus of the book of 1 Samuel. Almost everything that happens in 1 Samuel is traced back to one of those three figures. Not absolutely everything, but almost everything. And as far as the period of time that it covers, we're talking about a period of somewhere between 94 and 120 years. How do you know which one it is? I don't really know. I mean, I look at different guys, and one guy says, well, 94 years, and which makes me kind of wonder, why 94? Why not 95 or 96? He says 94 years. And I read another guy, and he says, well, 120 years. So those are just kind of the framework that we see. We see it something being in the neighborhood of 100 years. Maybe you could say, give or take 10 years. Other keys to the book of 1 Samuel is we see that it is a dramatic, gripping book of the Bible. You know, 1 Samuel is just sort of a teacher's paradise because the stories in it, the accounts, the narrative, the drama, the characters are so compelling that it's a book that, at least from a teacher's standpoint, a Bible teacher's standpoint, perhaps I should say, it almost teaches itself. And so it's really wonderful to teach, and it's wonderful to read and to think about. Now, hopefully you've already done your reading through the book of 1 Samuel. You've read through it chapter by chapter, and you've written a sentence or two upon every chapter. That's an important thing for you to do before you get to class. And you've read this. You've read the story of David and Goliath. You've read the story of Jonathan and his adventures. You've read the stories about Saul and his foolishness. You've read the stuff about Samuel and his confrontation of the nation, and then later on his confrontation of Saul. You've read about David on the run from King Saul, on and on and on. Compelling, powerful, rich stories, narratives. Now, when I say stories, I'm not trying to imply for a moment that they're not true. They're true stories, but they're wonderful stories nevertheless. 1 Samuel is also interesting because it was originally one book with 2 Samuel. It was the Septuagint, that is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures that was done, in the neighborhood of 150 years before the time of Jesus. The Septuagint originally divided it into two books. So at one time, 1st and 2nd Samuel were one book together, basically called the First of the Kings. And then it was divided into 1st and 2nd Samuel. If you were to describe, give some key words for the book of 1 Samuel, I would suppose you'd probably say that it's the key words of transition and kingdom. This is what's important, these key words, transition and kingdom. And the key verses would be 1 Samuel chapter 12, 13, and 13, 14. Let's take a look at those two verses right here, right now. First of all, 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13 says, "Now therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen and whom you have desired. And take note, the Lord has set a king over you." Now you have to admit, this is a pretty big deal in the history of Israel. Up to this point, they existed all the way time when you could say Israel had its barest, smallest beginnings at the time of Abraham. You had the time of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. You had all their time in Egypt when they were enslaved, the 400 some years in Egypt. You had the time of coming out of the wilderness under Moses. You had the time of conquest under Joshua. You had the period of occupation of the land under the judges. Under all of that time, and you're talking about close to, maybe not exactly, but close to 1,000 years of history, Israel did not have a king. Now they finally had a king coming up into 1 Samuel. And we see it here, this sort of key announcement, this declaration of God to the people. "Now therefore, here's the king whom you have chosen and whom you have desired, and take note, the Lord has set a king over you." Then again, we also have this verse in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, speaking about the kind of man that God is looking to be a king. Because what we have in 1 Samuel is a contrast. We have a contrast between Saul and a contrast between David. So look, here is the contrast presented. "But now your kingdom shall not continue." This is God speaking to Saul. "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And so we see a very interesting dynamic in the book of 1 Samuel. I spoke to you about these transitions, and let me just repeat the point. You have a transition in the book of 1 Samuel, a transition from the period of the judges to the first king Saul, but then you also have a transition between the rejected King Saul and the soon-to-be accepted King David. Now, again, as I said, David never takes the throne in the book of 1 Samuel. That's some of the first order of business that happens in 2 Samuel. As we go on, we think about the author of the book. By the way, let me just go back a couple slides. You saw this where I indicated that the key chapter was 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 15 is the place where God formally and definitively rejects Saul as king over Israel. And he says, "I will go out and seek this man." In 1 Samuel chapter 16, that's when God says, "Now I will choose David," and he chooses David, anoints him for the throne in 1 Samuel 16. But 15 is the place where Saul is definitively and finally rejected as having a perpetual dynasty in the land of Israel. So going on now, we take a look at this book, the book of 1 Samuel. Who is the author of the book? Well, we don't know, so we list the author as anonymous. Now, by tradition, Samuel authored the account in 1 Samuel up to his death. We frankly don't know who authored the rest. Now, how can we say that we believe that Samuel wrote at least part of the book? Well, because the text itself tells us that Samuel wrote a book. Take a look at this from 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 25, where we read, "Then Samuel explained to the people the behavior of royalty and wrote it in a book and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, every man to his house." You see, we know that Samuel wrote books and stored them up. And this is one of the indications that people also have that Samuel may have well had a role in the authorship of Judges and of Ruth and of the book of 1 Samuel, at least up until the point of his death. So that's a pretty good indication that perhaps in part Samuel was author of the book of 1 Samuel. But that's not all there is to it. Who wrote the rest of the book? Well, we see a clue in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 29. Check this verse out. I don't know if you've ever noted this verse, but 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 29 says this. Now the acts of King David, first and last, indeed they are written in the book of Samuel the seer, in the book of Nathan the prophet, and in the book of Gad the seer. And there are many people think that based on this verse, this tells us that there were actually 3 authors to 1st and 2nd Samuel collectively. Samuel wrote up until his death, and then Nathan the prophet took over, and then Gad the seer, which is really just another way of describing a prophet. And I think that this is probably the most logical, but we can't say with certainty that these were the authors, but it would certainly make a lot of sense to be able to say that it was Samuel, Nathan, and Gad who contributed together to write the book of 1 Samuel. Now, we do find at least one place in the book of 1 Samuel that must have been added in from the time after Solomon. What do I mean by that? Well, remember that we had 3 kings of Israel, the first 3 kings, who served under what we call the United Kingdom, where all the 12 tribes of Israel served under one king. And so you had Saul, David, and Solomon. But after Solomon came his son Rehoboam, and then a rebel against Rehoboam, Jeroboam. Those 2 were responsible for the dividing of the tribes of Israel. The 10 northern tribes became what we call the kingdom of Israel. The 2 southern tribes became what we call the kingdom of Judah. Well, there's an interesting verse in 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 6, which says this, So Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. That verse seems to make, and again, it's not definite enough to be sure, but it seems to make a distinction between the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. So that verse may have been added on by a later scribe or something writing in the time of the divided kingdom between north and south. So again, authorship, we really don't have much uncertainty, but it would make sense to, all except for a couple stray verses here and there, to assign it to Samuel, to Gad, and to Nathan, even as described in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 29. What's next with us? Well, let's just kind of summarize the book as an entire theme. You could say this. 1 Samuel records the crucial transition from the theocracy under the judges. Theocracy means rule by God, without a king, but recognizing God as being the king. Excuse me. It records the crucial transition from the theocracy under the judges to the monarchy under the kings by focusing on 3 lives, Samuel, Saul, and David. Again, I think it's important to recognize that we cover 3 lives with the book of 1 Samuel. Now, 2 of those lives, they are encompassed completely in the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel doesn't go beyond the book of 1 Samuel. Saul doesn't go beyond the book of 1 Samuel, but David certainly does. And so you have these 3 leading figures, Samuel, Saul, and David, and through their lives we record the transition from the theocracy under the judges to the monarchy under the kings. Next, how would we say that the book of 1 Samuel advances God's plan of redemption? Well, first of all, it establishes the place of a king in Israel. Now, this bears a little bit of our talking about, because we're saying that this is one of the main features of the book of Judges, that it deals with this whole period where we went from the rule of the judges unto the rule of the kings. And it wasn't necessarily, at least in the very beginning, a smooth transition. In other words, the people consciously rejected the leadership of Samuel. Well, no, let me rephrase that. They did not reject the leadership of Samuel, they rejected the leadership of Samuel's sons. You see, the way I kind of say it, and the text doesn't specifically say it, but I don't think this is a big jump for us to say, Samuel was such a good and such a godly leader. Matter of fact, when you compare Samuel to any of the judges that are in the book of Judges, you see why it's good not to have Samuel in the book of Judges. He's so much a better man. He's an outstanding man. Samuel the judge is sort of head and shoulders above any of the other judges that are listed in the book of Judges. I would suppose about the only one that even kind of vaguely compares him that we know anything about. I'm not talking about the ones that are mentioned just in a verse or two. Would almost be Deborah. Deborah, she comes off as a very godly, wise person. But Gideon had his problems. Jephthah certainly had his problems. Samson, for heaven's sakes, he had his problems. But Samuel seems to be of a different character altogether. And he was such a good and such a godly leader of ancient Israel that they wanted Samuel to continue on, but they knew that his sons were not of the same caliber as the father. They looked at the sons of Samuel and they said, no way, man, these guys don't love the Lord. They don't have the same strength of character. They don't have the same giftings that their father did. So what are we going to do? Well, when they saw that Samuel was advancing in age, when they saw that his sons were unfit to continue, they still wanted a strong leadership as reflected by the life of Samuel, and they asked God to give them a king. Well, this was sort of a rejection of God being king. This was sort of a thing of saying, listen, Lord, we don't want to recognize you as being our king. We want to instead choose a human being to stand in that place of being a king. And it's really kind of interesting as it's recorded here in 1 Samuel chapter 8, where it speaks of this rejection of God as king, how actually what they really wanted was they wanted to have a king just like the other nations did. Maybe I can read this to you from 1 Samuel chapter 8, where it says this. 1 Samuel chapter 6, well, I'll begin, chapter 8, I should say, starting at verse 5. Let me start at verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make for us a king to judge us like all the other nations. That was really their motivation for wanting a king. And it was not a good motivation. Listen, it may have been true that God had it in his plan that there would one day be a king of Israel. Matter of fact, I believe that it was in God's plan for them one day to have a king over Israel. I believe God intended that from the very beginning. You see, for hundreds of years of Israel's existence, God did not want them to have a king. He wanted them to look to him, to look to Yahweh as their king, and to not be like the other nations. Yet I still believe that at the right time and in the right circumstances, God wanted them to have a king. Why do I say that? I say that based on Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. Now, we'll take a look at that passage in just a moment. But before we look at that passage, let me explain something. Deuteronomy chapter 17 happened, 400 or 500 years, somewhere between 400 and 500 years, before Israel ever chose a king. So 400 years before they ever asked Samuel to provide them a king, God gave them instructions about a king. Look at what I mean here. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 17, beginning now at verse 14, where we read, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as a king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of the law in a book, of this law in a book, from one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and to be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Pretty cool, isn't it? That God gave specific instructions to the people of Israel 400 years before they ever had a king about them having a king. Now, I think one of the things this shows is, I believe it displays that God always had it on his heart for Israel to have a king at the right time and in the right circumstances. I think the great sin of Israel, especially reflected in 1 Samuel chapter 8, is that they got ahead of God and they sought a king for the wrong reasons. Because there's no doubt that to want a king to be just like the other nations, that's not a good reason. If they would have said, Samuel, we respect your godly leadership so much. We're so honored by all that you do for us, and we want this strong leadership to continue. Well, maybe that would be another factor. But that's not what they said, and that's not what was on their heart. Now, there's a bit more we could talk about this question of a king and such, but what I want you to understand, we'll talk about that a little bit later when we end our teaching, talking about some of the problems that are thought to be in the book of 1 Samuel. So let me go back to my previous slide and just see what other examples do we have of advancing God's plan of redemption here. Well, you have an example of a bad king, that is Saul, and then you have the beginnings of a good king, that's David. Listen, leadership in God's kingdom is very important. And whether leadership is good or bad, there's something that God's people can learn from it, isn't there? And so we can learn, and God's people, and if you could say, the universe is instructed by a bad king and what he does, and then it's also instructed by a good king. Now, we admit that David doesn't actually take the throne in 1 Samuel, but we see the beginnings of his character and the kind of man he is and how he's displayed to be genuinely a man after God's heart. We see the beginnings of a good king in David. Now we also see that God preserved Israel in the land despite their enemies. 1 Samuel is filled with a lot of fighting. There's enemies on every side, in particular the Philistines. We'll talk about the Philistines in a little bit. But in particular the Philistines, and if they could, they would drive Israel out of the land. Matter of fact, there were times when it seems like they would succeed in driving Israel out of the land. So God's preservation of Israel in the land despite their enemies, that is an important factor for their ongoing work. And then next, we have just simply this idea of establishing the line of David from which would come Jesus the Messiah. Well, this certainly furthers God's plan of redemption. Essential to God's plan of redemption is to bring forth this Redeemer, is to bring forth this one, this Messiah, the Savior. And here we have the actual family line and the establishing, if you will, of the royal line from which David would come. And this denotes, or adds to it, I should say, a whole royal aspect to the genealogy of Jesus that we need to pay attention to. So going on next, where does the book of 1 Samuel appear in the whole thing of the Old Testament books? Well, again, as we've kind of gone, and I know this is a little bit basic by now, but sometimes it's important to repeat the basic things. We see that the book of 1 Samuel is not part of the law, the books of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, nor is it part of the poetic books of the Old Testament, the wisdom books such as Psalms and Proverbs and so on, nor is it part of the properly prophetic books of the Old Testament, either the major or the minor prophets. It belongs in the category of the historical books of the Old Testament, and it is the 4th of the historical books, following a rough chronology: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, now 1 Samuel. So what do we make of the 1 Samuel? Let's kind of take a look at these charts. Again, these charts that I've kind of borrowed or lifted from the Open Bible and their introduction. Again, I just think these charts are wonderful, so that we'd consider them a little bit. Let's take a look at the focus of the book of 1 Samuel. First of all, you see it divided into 2 parts. You have the focus being Samuel in the first part of it, up till chapter 8, actually. And then after that, you have the focus being Saul, who was the first king of Israel. So you see it focused on the period of the Judges up until chapter 8. And then you see it focused on Saul arriving now up into chapter, up until the end of the book, because Saul he's not finished until the very end of the book. Secondly, we have this second aspect of it, what we would call the topic of the book. First, in the period of Samuel, you have the declining period of the Judges. beginning first with Eli, who was the high priest of Israel, then transferring over to Samuel. Eli and Samuel were the last two judges of the kingdom of Israel. They judged in those days. But that ends with the end of chapter 7. Beginning now at chapter 8, you're entering into the focus upon Saul and David and what you would call the rise of the kings. The judges are declining, the kings are rising, and you have these characters, Eli and Samuel, representing the judges. You have the characters Saul and David representing the kings. Although I keep repeating it, and I just don't know why I feel compelled to repeat it, but I'll repeat it again. David does not actually take the throne in the book of 1 Samuel. It's just that the way is paved for him to take the throne by the end of the book. Next, we have our reference and division. Again, we notice that through the first 7 chapters up to chapter 8, we have the first transition of leadership in the book, and that's the transition between Eli and Samuel. Eli, the old prophet who sort of raised Samuel, as Samuel was brought to the tabernacle as just a little boy. And really, it's one wonderful story in the first 2 chapters of how Samuel's parents were unable to conceive a child. Samuel's mother cries out to the Lord. Her name was Hannah. And she cries out to the Lord, and she's just heartbroken in prayer because she can't have a child. And then finally, the high priest Eli comes along and promises her, no, you will receive a child. This is going to happen. And she's overjoyed by that, and she promises that she will dedicate her child in a special way unto the Lord. And that's exactly what she did. That child was Samuel, and Samuel was dedicated to God as a very young child, anywhere from 3 to 5 years of age. He was brought to the temple, and to the tabernacle, which functioned as the temple. He was brought to the tabernacle, and he served the high priest Eli at the tabernacle. Nevertheless, there had to be a time of transition. So there was a transition of leadership from Eli to Samuel, and then remaining from chapter 4 through chapter 7, you have the judgeship of Samuel. Then beginning in chapter 8, around till the beginning of chapter 13, you have a second transition of leadership, the transition from Samuel to Saul, King Saul. And then you have, beginning in chapter 13 and continuing on to 15, you have these chapters that really describe for us the reign of Saul and what that was like. But then with chapter 15, you have a third transition of leadership from Saul to David, where you see that even though Saul remained on the throne of Israel, the anointing and the favor of God passed from Saul to David. And this is what we know. We know from our own spiritual experience that if the favor and the blessing and anointing from God rested on David instead of Saul, it was only a matter of time till the actual throne passed from Saul unto David. So continuing on here now, we have a period of time. The Open Bible notes put it as about 94 years. I've seen other estimates about 120 years. Whatever, it's about the same period of time. Maybe they have different slightly beginning and ending points, but this gives you an approximate marking point. And then as far as the geography, I'm going to differ. Let's go back to this idea of time. You see on the red chart on the screen right now, this indicates for us right where this period of 100 or 94 years was. This actually includes the red part that you're looking at, 1st and 2nd Samuel. So I've combined the two in that particular red chart. So it's a little bit wider than just the book of 1 Samuel, but this is the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, taking up that thing in the red portion there. Going on, we talk about next the location where everything happens in the book of Samuel. It takes place all in Canaan. Now, I might have said that it takes place all in Israel, but that would not be precisely correct. Because some of the events that happen in an area that is the land of Canaan, but did not belong to Israel proper. What do I mean? Well, again, as an after effect from the unfaithfulness coming forth from the time of Judges, Israel did not occupy the entire land of Canaan. They occupied almost none of the coast during the judgeship of Samuel and during the reign of King Saul. Let me show you what I mean by giving you a proper map to look at. If you take a look at this map, Israel in the days of King Saul, and by the way, if I don't have this map up on the website, I will have this map up on the website by the time that you read it, because I want you to be able to see what I think is a pretty good map right here. Anyway, Israel in the days of King Saul, you can notice something here, that the brown area to the south on the coast, and the brown area, light brown is what I'm talking about, the beige, perhaps I should say, beige area on the coast to the north and to the south, that's the land of the Philistines to the south. It's the land of the Phoenicians to the north. And in between, there's sort of a, I don't know, pinkish mauve kind of area. That's the land of the Canaanites right there on the central coast. So what I want you to see is all this coastal area was not occupied by the Israelites. The Israelites occupied the territory. You'll see it here on the map. That's sort of in the mid-brown range. That was the kingdom of Israel during the days of King Saul. And just to make the point home, look at the second map where you see the three arrows pointing. The top arrow pointing to the land that was held by the Phoenicians, the middle area pointing to the coastal lands held by the Canaanites, which, by the way, extended inland at least enough to encompass Jebus, Jerusalem, or the Jebusite city. And then finally, the yellow arrow I have pointing to the area of the Philistines. And why do I have a different color area pointing to the Philistines? Well, because really during the reign of Samuel as a judge and the reign of Saul as a king, there really wasn't a whole lot of interaction between Israel and the Phoenicians. There was some interaction, but not a whole lot, between Israel and the Canaanites. But there was a lot of interaction between Israel and the Philistines. The Philistines become major players in the story as we come to the book 1 Samuel. Matter of fact, we could say that if you wanted to talk about the leading characters of the book of 1 Samuel, who would they be? Well, you'd start off with Eli and his sons. Eli and his two sons. Well, Eli was an interesting man. He was the high priest, and in some ways he seemed to be a godly man, but the great area of failure where Eli had, his great area of failure was in his, you could either say inability, you could say refusal, whichever way you want to put it, the way that he did not discipline his sons. And so his two sons grew up. Now, one thing you have to remember about the office of high priest was it was passed on by lineage. So one of these two sons, Hophni was the name of one son, Phinehas was the name of the other. These two sons, they were going to inherit the high priesthood, the office, and they were very wicked and ungodly men. And so you have Eli, you have his weakness as a father, you have his inability or unwillingness to restrain his own sons, but then you have Samuel come into the picture. And I find this sort of interesting in the whole story, the connections that are made. It seems that Eli completely failed as a parent with his own two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Yet Eli was a sort of a parent to Samuel, and frankly, he seemed to do a pretty good job with Samuel. He did a great job with Samuel. It's just one of these sort of ironies of the Bible that why could it be that Eli seems to have been a good parent to Samuel, where he was a bad, or at the very most charitable, you could say, a weak parent when he came to his own sons. And that's an interesting sort of dynamic. So you have Eli and his sons. Then you have Samuel, this man whom we have his life from beginning to end within the book of 1 Samuel. You have the time from before he was born and when his mother was crying out for a child before God to the time that he was dead. And as a matter of fact, we have an interesting case late in the book of 1 Samuel where Samuel seems to come back from the dead and appears back in the book of 1 Samuel. So he really is the one who dominates this book from beginning and then with an appearance at the end. The next person you have is a man named Saul. Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, who was selected to be the first king over Israel. And Saul was selected not because of his godliness. Saul was selected because he was tall and he was handsome. That's what the biblical text tells us. This is what the people of Israel liked about Saul. And God essentially gave Israel the kind of king they wanted. In the previous semester, I taught a class on the life of David, so we talked about Saul a good deal. And I used this phrase to describe King Saul in the previous class. I called him the king from central casting. In other words, you can imagine the movie director just, calling the casting department and saying, "Get me a guy who looks like a king." And that was Saul. Tall, good-looking, great, profile on the cover of Royalty Monthly. What Saul didn't have was there's really very little evidence in the scriptures that he had any real relationship with the Lord. There are a couple times when Saul is shown to be a spiritual man, but it's fleeting, and it almost seems that those few moments happened almost against his will, or at least he was not pursuing the Lord when those things came upon him. And so Saul turns out to be a very tragic figure. In the beginning, he's humble. In the beginning, he trusts God. In the beginning, God does some great things through him. But the life of Saul crumbles as he becomes more proud, more insulated, more paranoid, more disobedient against God. So we see the tragic rise and the even more tragic fall of a man named Saul. Well, sort of a cheerier figure from the household of Saul is this man Jonathan. Jonathan was the son of Saul. As a matter of fact, Jonathan was the one who was in line to receive the king when Saul died. I mean, that's how it works in a monarchy, isn't it? A person is the king, and their eldest son, that's the one who's next in line. Well, Jonathan himself was a godly, capable man. He loved the Lord. He had a passion for God. He was a man of bold faith. He was a man of great ability when it came to the military as well. And so you have this whole dynamic here of Jonathan would have made a very capable king, yet God did not want to honor or use the dynasty of Saul. Instead, he went outside the dynasty of Saul to put his mark on the man who would be the next king of Israel. Now again, he never took the kingdom in the book of 1 Samuel. That has to wait for the book of 2 Samuel. But God chose him and marked him out and anointed him for that selection way back in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Before the book is even half over, God picks this man, David, to be the successor. So it's really fascinating to see how this works with David. David becomes this great successor, a man who was chosen for this as a relatively young man. We really don't have a concrete number on the age when David was selected to be the next king of Israel. The estimates usually run anywhere from the age of 13 to the age of 16. And as I said before, we don't know exactly sure, but in some respect, he was a young man. And being a young man, he had a lot to learn, but he had a great heart after God. This is what's so impressive about David. What Saul lacked, what seemed to be so absent from the man Saul, seemed to be so filled in the life of David. He had a life that was so alive unto God. Now, we see this in the book of 1 Samuel, but we see it even more so if you connect the book of 1 Samuel to the book of Psalms. Because even though David did not write all of the Psalms, he wrote many of them. And so many of these Psalms reflect this great, large, passionate heart after God. If Saul was the man who had gifts and talents and abilities and advantages, but no real relationship with God, David had some advantages, he had some disadvantages. His youth was a disadvantage. His status in his family was a disadvantage. His relative inexperience was a disadvantage. His family position was, his dad was a lowly farmer. All these things were disadvantages, yet nevertheless, he had one advantage that far outstripped all the disadvantages, and that great advantage that David had was he had a heart after God. He genuinely loved God. He genuinely knew God. He genuinely trusted God. And the hand of God and the anointing of God on David's life is something remarkable and wonderful throughout the book of 1 Samuel. So again, from the top, we have Eli and his sons. We have Samuel, we have Saul, we have Jonathan, we have David. We've covered just about all the leading characters in the book of 1 Samuel, but there's one at the bottom of the list that I should at least note, and it's a simple group of people known as the Philistines. The Philistines actually play a pretty large role in the book of 1 Samuel. Now, let me go back a slide or two and just remind you about where the Philistines lived. If you see where that yellow area arrow points on the map, that points to the general area of the Philistines, although you should know that during the reign of Saul, when the Philistines were making great progress, they almost advanced so far eastward that they almost cut the kingdom of Israel in two. They made great advances. And so there were seasons or periods during the time of the book of 1 Samuel when their territory was even larger than what you see on this map, extending eastward into central Israel. In any regard, what do we make of the Philistines? Well, let me get together a couple of quotes for you that I think speak about the condition of the Philistines very well. First of all, you would say this: the Philistines were an immigrant people from the military aristocracy of the island of Crete. By the way, that's mentioned in Amos chapter 9, verse 7. Small numbers of Philistines were in the land at the time of Abraham, so hundreds of years before the time of 1 Samuel. But they came in larger numbers soon after Israel came to Canaan from Egypt. They were organized into 5 city-states. So please understand this. There were Philistines in the land. Now, one thing you got to understand, the Philistines came from the Greek world. The island of Crete was populated mainly by people influenced from Greek civilization. So the Philistines were connected with Greek civilization in a way that the Israelites were not. And they were present in the land even from the time of Abraham, but they started immigrating in large numbers during the days of Joshua. Now, Israel competed on more or less equal terms with their neighbors Moab and Ammon and some of the other nations around, the Edomites, for example. But the Philistines had Greek military equipment, such as metal helmets, shields, chainmail armor, swords, and spears, and this made them more formidable opponents. The Philistines were the first people in Canaan to process iron, and they made the most of it. So you need to understand that in many ways, the Philistines had impressive technological advantages over the Israelites. And they were a people of immigrants that had more immigrants on the way. They were interested in expansion. And so it's no surprise to us that in one sense, the Philistines wanted to do to the Israelites what the Israelites had done to the Canaanites generations before. One other thing we could say about the Philistines, one guy named Smith, writing in something called the Pulpit Commentary, he says this: "Never did times seem more hopeless than when Samuel arose. The Philistines, strengthened not merely by a constant influx of immigrants, but by the importation of arms for Greece, were fast reducing Israel to the condition of a subject race." When the book of 1 Samuel takes place, and a matter of fact, even to the end of the book of 1 Samuel, you need to realize something. The book of 1 Samuel ends with a disastrous battle for Israel where the Philistines defeated them almost completely and killed Saul and his son Jonathan in the battle. So all throughout 1 Samuel, the Philistines are strong. Oh, sometimes they're beat back to some extent or another, but all throughout the book of 1 Samuel, the Philistines are strong. And the future is very uncertain for Israel, because if the Philistines could completely subjugate the Israelites, they would have been delighted to do so. So that's important, some background on the Philistines, who they were and what they did. Let's take a look at some of the important events in the book of 1 Samuel. First, we have Samuel's birth and training. We spoke about that. Really, you would say he had a miraculous birth because his mother was barren and could not bear children. But because she prayed, because Eli, the high priest, was so kind to her, she was able to conceive and bear a child. And that child was Samuel, and he was dedicated unto the Lord, and he received a very unique training in the first few chapters of 1 Samuel. You understand that great section in 1 Samuel chapter 3 where God speaks to Samuel as a little boy. It says, "Samuel, Samuel," and Samuel awakes, and he thinks it's Eli speaking to him. So he runs into the high priest Eli, and he says, "Eli, what's going on? What did you want?" and Eli sends him back to bed. And it happens again. He runs in, he says, Eli, what did you want? And he sends him back to bed again. The third time he realizes this is the Lord speaking to him. So he tells him, Samuel, if this happens again, tell God that you're listening to his word. Speak, Lord, for your servant listens. And God spoke to Samuel. And I think it's absolutely remarkable. 1 Samuel chapter 3 relates how the message that God spoke to Eli the high priest through Samuel the little boy was a message of judgment. God used a little boy named Samuel to bring the message of judgment to the high priest Eli, which was an unusual way to bring the message of judgment, but God did it nevertheless. Next, another important event, you see the Philistines conquering the city of Shiloh and taking the Ark of the Covenant, and the death of Eli and his two sons. This is a tremendous disaster that you have here in 1 Samuel chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6, because not only did they conquer the city of Shiloh, but they kept the Ark of the Covenant, and they took it back and they put it in front of their god Dagon, or some people would say Dagon, there in the temple in the city of Ashdod. They took it to Ashdod. And so they took it to the temple of Dagon. Well, when it was in the temple of Dagon, a funny thing happened. When the priests of Dagon left the temple at night, there was the Ark of the Covenant sitting before this great statue of Dagon. When they woke up in the next morning, they looked, and the statue of Dagon had fallen on its face before the Ark of the Covenant. And so what do? They put it back together and they put it back up again. But it happened again, and then God sent tumors upon the people of Ashdod. And anyway, the whole lesson of the story of the time that the Ark of the Covenant was with the people of Ashdod and among the Philistines was that God was more than capable of taking care of his own glory. He could do it. He knew exactly how he could do it. So they send the Ark of the Covenant back to the people of Israel. It comes back to Israel there in chapters 6 and 7 of 1 Samuel. And then actually, we find something really remarkable in 1 Samuel chapter 7. When it came back to Israel, the Ark of the Covenant is what I mean, there was a sense of revival. You know, when the Ark of the Covenant was lost to the people of Israel, they felt that God had abandoned them. When it came back, they felt that God had come back to them. Now, what's so significant about this is that it prompted a sense of national revival. Let me read to you. I'm just going to start reading from 1 Samuel chapter 7, beginning now at verse 3. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, If you return to the Lord with all your hearts, and put away the foreign gods and the Ashereths from among you, and prepare your hearts for the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. So the children of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashereths, and served the Lord only. And Samuel said, Gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered together at Mizpah, drew water, and poured it out before the Lord. And they fasted that day and said there, We have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the children of Israel at Mizpah. Friends, that's just beautiful description of what you just call revival among God's people there at Mizpah under the prophet Samuel. But look at what happens. I'm going to keep reading now. Now I'm at verse 7 of 1 Samuel chapter 7. Now when the Philistines heard that the children of Israel had gathered together at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went against Israel. And when the children of Israel heard it, they were afraid of the Philistines. So the children of Israel cried to Samuel, Do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. And friends, you know what happened? It's really remarkable. God sent lightning, God sent thunder, God sent judgment upon the Philistines' armies, and God protected the Israelites in an amazing way when Israel really trusted in him. You see, 1 Samuel chapter 7 is almost this chapter describing of what it could have been like in Israel if they would have trusted him. God would have supernaturally protected them in amazing ways. Well, that's chapter 7. Chapter 8 continues on, and we see that the tribes of Israel then sort of reject Samuel's sons to succeed him. They were very happy with Samuel's leadership, but they rejected the leadership of Samuel's sons. And then finally, in chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, we see the choice of Saul as it works out, who again started out very humble before the Lord, but he didn't stay that way. But we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Let's first of all talk about the successes of King Saul. When you think about it, for the most part, Saul was a very successful general, a very successful leader of Israel. Now, his own relationship with God wasn't right, but on many levels, he had a very successful military career. Let me show you this chart on this next thing. You see here that Saul fought many different battles against the Ammonites, the Philistines multiple times against Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Zobah, and then the Amalekites again, and then twice again against the Philistines. And most of these battles he won, all except for the last one. But the pressure was so constant, it was so complete, that they kept on fighting again and again. He had repeated wars against the Philistines that came back to him again and again and again. And this was one of the things that King Saul had to reckon with. But I'm just trying to draw attention to this fact. You take a look at this chart and you realize that overall, you've got a remarkable record of victory. This is a man who won a lot of battles for the sake of Israel. He did a lot of good for them. There was definitely a period of success for Saul, and even after he stopped being a spiritual success, or that's really not the right way to phrase it. Let me phrase it a little better way. Even when his spiritual failure was fully exposed, in many ways he kept on winning battles in the name of the Lord. Well, in any regard, we come on next to some of the important events of the book of 1 Samuel. We see that Saul had a succession, first of all, sinful sacrifices in 1 Samuel 13. He sacrificed in an unauthorized way before God, and the prophet Samuel called him on it. I love to kind of preach on that passage because it's an example of how excuse-making is very prominent. Saul showed himself to be a supreme excuse maker in the way that he made excuses for why he sacrificed. We see in 1 Samuel chapter 14 that he makes a selfish curse. And what was the curse? Well, he commanded his army to fast on the day of battle. And can I just tell you, that's not good advice. You want your soldiers full of energy. You want their stomachs full. You want your soldiers to fight the best you can on a full stomach. But he made a selfish and really a stupid curse, and it came back to affect him. Then in 1 Samuel chapter 15, you see what might have been Saul's greatest error, his incomplete obedience. God called Saul to do something really remarkable, something that we had not seen from the book since the time of the book of Joshua, and really was leftover business from the book of Joshua. One of the things that God commanded the armies of Israel to do in the book of Joshua was to completely eliminate, to bring a war of judgment against the Amalekites. And yet they failed to do it. They did not do it. Well, God wanted that work to be carried out under the reign of King Saul. He wanted him, in a very unique way, to complete this war of judgment against the Amalekites and to wipe them out. He told him to do everything, to kill everything. And we talked about this when we studied the book of Judges, how, yes, this is disturbing. It's disturbing when God commands such a complete war of judgment. And you say, well, why would God command them to kill the sheep and the oxen? I mean, they didn't do anything wrong. Why? Well, one of the reasons was God didn't want anybody to profit from a war of judgment. If God was going to, in a unique way, use Israel as an instrument of his judgment, he didn't want anybody in Israel to be happy about it. He didn't want anybody to come home with a couple new goats and say, look at the great goats I got when God used us to bring judgment upon the Amalekites. God didn't want that. So nobody was going to take profit from a war of judgment. In any regard, God commanded Saul to completely wipe out the Amalekites, and he mostly did. He did with two exceptions. First of all, he did not do it in regard to some of the livestock. He kept some of the livestock, whether to enrich himself, maybe as he claimed, to sacrifice unto the Lord, whatever. But he didn't obey God. But most importantly, he did not obey when it came to the fact of him killing the leaders and the people of the Amalekites. He left King Agag alive. And this was very wrong. He should not have done this. And so if I could just read this to you, it's really striking here. Verse 28 of 1 Samuel chapter 15. So Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to a neighbor of yours who's better than you." By the way, that was King David, David to come. Verse 29, "And also the strength of Israel will not lie nor relent, for he is not a man that he should relent." Then he said, "I have sinned, yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me, so that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Then Samuel said, "Bring Agag, the king of the Amalekites, here to me." So Agag came to him cautiously, and Agag said, "Surely the bitterness of death is past." You see, and this is such an amazing section of Scripture, Saul spared the life of King Agag. Now, he shouldn't have, but he did. He spared the life of King Agag in disobedience to God. And Agag probably figured, well, if the warrior Saul spared my life, then for sure the man of God, Samuel, is going to spare my life. Who are you more afraid of? A king in battle armor with a sword and all the rest of it? Or a prophet? You know, which one are you more afraid of? Well, he thought, man, if I'm dealing with the prophet Samuel, then my life is safe. The bitterness of death is past. But that's not how it worked out. Look at verse 33. Then Samuel said, "As your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women." And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. What? Samuel, now look, Samuel wasn't a warrior. He wasn't a warrior. But he was a priest. And as a priest of the Lord, he knew how to sacrifice animals. And what the sacrifice of animals was all about was cutting them up. Samuel knew how to take a big, huge knife and start hacking up animals with it. And that's what he did to Agag. Oh, such a powerful story. But it all reflects back to Saul's incomplete obedience. And you could say that it's in chapter 15 that finally and completely God says, "No, Saul, you are going to be taken out of the throne eventually, and your son will not succeed you. This will not be a dynasty in Israel." Well, continuing on for events in the book of 1 Samuel, you see 1 Samuel chapter 17, David kills Goliath, which was a huge victory for Israel. Don't forget that this was also a defeat of the Philistines under Saul. The armies of Saul defeated the Philistines when David killed Goliath. So this was also a great victory for Saul. Even though, because of the fame that it gave to David, oh wow, David was really a target from Saul from then on. So David was anointed as the next king in 1 Samuel chapter 16. He kills Goliath in chapter 17. And then, by the way, there's some people who like to make this point, and I don't know if you can exactly make it from the Scriptures, but certainly you can mostly make it from the Scriptures. It's answering this trivia question: how did David kill Goliath? And most people say, well, with a stone and a sling. That's how he killed Goliath. Well, there's some evidence from the text that no, David knocked Goliath down with the stone and the sling. He killed him with Goliath's own sword. Let me just read to you the text here. It says, "And the Philistine came and began drawing near to David. The man who bore his armor went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and good-looking." And then here it goes, verse 48. "And so it was, when the Philistines arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine's forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took out his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. So some people like to make the point that technically David did not kill Goliath with a stone. He immobilized him with the stone, and he used Goliath's own sword to kill him. Because of David's rising popularity after the defeat of Goliath, and because David was such a wise, good man throughout all of this, his popularity began to rise, so much so that it rose even amongst Saul's own family. Because David and Jonathan, the son of Saul, became extremely good friends, just close as brothers. Matter of fact, they became so close as brothers that Jonathan, who was the crown prince under King Saul, he recognized that David would become the next king, and he yielded his position as crown prince. Now, you could say he did this privately. It wasn't a public thing, but privately, Jonathan said to David, "You will be the next king of Israel. Everybody knows it. I yield the throne to you." Well, Saul then spends several chapters attempting to kill David, 18, 19, and 20. And then David was running from and refusing to kill Saul when he could have over several chapters. 1 Samuel chapters 21 through 27 are basically David trying to escape from King Saul and King Saul coming back and trying to get him. And there were at least two occasions when David had the clear opportunity to kill King Saul, but he refused to do it. He refused to do it because David believed something. He believed that it was God's job to take care of King Saul. And really, friends, it was not only godly on behalf of King David, it was also wise. Wise in what way? Well, if God has told you through the prophet Samuel, you will be the next king of Israel, this is one thing you understand, that it's not a good thing to set the precedent, the example of becoming king by killing the previous king. You see, when David sits on the throne, he doesn't want anybody coming after him in that way. So David says, no, I don't want to set that precedent. I don't want anybody to think that the way to become king in Israel is by killing the previous king. So David would not touch the Lord's anointed. And when we say he would not touch the Lord's anointed, we mean he did not kill him when he had the opportunity to do so. And then finally, in the last few chapters, you have Saul's final decline and Saul's end. It's a very bitter end. Saul, with his army and his position being overrun by the Philistines, he realizes that he's about to be captured in battle. He does not want to be captured in battle, and so he falls on his own sword before the Philistines can catch him. And that's how the story of 1 Samuel ends. And we'll pick it up with 2 Samuel next time, but that's how 1 Samuel ends. So I just want you to, now obviously there's many events and nuances throughout the whole book that I left out, but I think in those couple slides that we looked at the important events, we sort of traced our way at least to the most important aspects of the book of 1 Samuel. What's next? Well, let's talk about where we see Jesus in the book of 1 Samuel. Well, first of all, because 1 Samuel really deals with and sort of exalts the idea of kingship, of royalty, we can see Jesus in the book of 1 Samuel as God's perfect king. The other thing we can see Jesus as in the book of 1 Samuel is Jesus being the man after God's own heart. Now, we know that David was a man after God's heart because we read in verse 14 of 1 Samuel chapter 13, "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over the people, over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Okay, so we get that David was a man after God's own heart, but was not Jesus the ultimate man after God's heart? David simply foreshadowed what Jesus completely fulfilled. We also see Jesus here as the representative and the deliverer of his people. Well, what do I mean? Well, I want you to think about it. Think about the story of David and Goliath. And isn't the story of David and Goliath actually a marvelous illustration of the work of Jesus on behalf of his people? Remember, when David fought Goliath, he did it on behalf of the entire nation of Israel. David's victory was Israel's victory. David's defeat would have been Israel's defeat, I should say, because they chose representatives to fight on their behalf. The Philistines had a representative fight on their behalf. His name was Goliath. The Israelites had a representative fight on their behalf. His name was David. And when David defeated Goliath, it was victory for Israel. Well, don't we see in this an illustration of the work of Jesus on our behalf? Jesus defeated sin. Jesus defeated death. Jesus defeated Satan on our behalf. And we, if we put ourselves in the place of the Israeli army on that 1 Samuel chapter 17, we win the victory as well. So you see Jesus very powerfully as the representative and the deliverer of his people in the whole story of David and Goliath. Finally, very plainly in the book of 1 Samuel, we see Jesus in the book of 1 Samuel as the son of David. You need to understand that Jesus, genetically speaking, was a descendant of Adam. He was a descendant of Noah. He was a descendant of Abraham. He was a descendant of Isaac. He was a descendant of Jacob. He was a descendant of Judah. He was a descendant of Boaz. He was a descendant of, many other multiple people. But I want you to understand, the scriptures never use the title of the Messiah, Jesus, son of Abraham, son of Adam, son of Boaz, son of Judah. No, but repeatedly and with great emphasis, the scriptures use the title of Jesus, of the Messiah, son of David. There is no biblical character more connected with Jesus the Messiah than David, son of Jesse, King David in the Old Testament. Matter of fact, there's 2 New Testament passages that speak to this with actually great power. Check this out. Romans chapter 1, verse 3, we read this. Concerning his son Jesus Christ our Lord, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh. That's it. According to the flesh, Jesus Christ is the son of David. He came from him. But I think even more revealing, and again, I'm leaving out all the passages in the Gospels where Jesus is called the son of David. There's many passages in there that call him. If you were to skip over to Revelation chapter 22, and you realize Revelation chapter 22, you're talking about the last chapter in the Bible. You're talking about what Jesus describes himself as being. Notice this. He says, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, the bright and morning star. Do you realize that in the last chapter of the Bible, Jesus identifies himself with David? Actually, he identifies himself with David in an absolutely engaging way. First, he calls himself the root of David. In other words, David came from him. Since Jesus is the creator of all things, he created the genetic pool from which David came from. He is the root of David, and yet at the same time, paradoxically and wonderfully, he is the offspring of David. The root and the offspring of David. I just think it's awesome that Jesus is so present in the book of 1 Samuel and in the life of David that Jesus calls himself the root and the offspring of David, and he does it in the very last chapter of the Bible. All right, what else do we have here in the book of 1 Samuel? Well, we can ask ourselves the question, what if 1 Samuel was not in the Bible? Well, what if? Well, I think there would be some unanswered questions in the Bible. We might ask ourselves the question legitimately, how does the concept of the Messiah relate to the concept of the king? And we get this, that it happens through the lineage of David. That's how the Messiah relates to the concept of the king. The Messiah is a king because he is the son of David. Now, you could think that theoretically, and again, I'm just speaking theoretically, the Messiah would not necessarily have to be a king, but yet he was, and he has to be because he is the son of David. It brings those 2 strands together in a profound way. But then secondly, we also see that the book of 1 Samuel, now again, I don't want to imply that this is the only book of the Bible that does it, but it is pretty powerful in how it does it. It shows us what God requires from a king or a ruler. The kind of obedience, the kind of heart, the kind of work that God requires on behalf of a king or a ruler, it's displayed in the book of 1 Samuel. It's displayed in a negative way in the person of Saul. It's displayed in a positive way in the person of David. Next, let's talk about some problem passages in the book of 1 Samuel, and we've got several of these, but then we'll conclude with this section of the problem passages in the book of 1 Samuel. First of all, 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 19, were there really 50,070 men at Beth Shemesh killed for looking in the Ark of the Covenant? Well, actually, that's what 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 19 says. Let me read it to you. It says, "Then he struck the men of Beth Shemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. He struck 50,070 men of the people, and the people lamented because the Lord had struck the people with a great slaughter." Well, this seems very difficult to believe, frankly. It seems very difficult to believe that a relatively small city like Beth Shemesh would even have 50,070 men. And secondly, that there would be such an extensive devastation. Well, when you dig into the Hebrew manuscripts, you see that there's good reason to doubt the numbering of the passage. The wording that's used to describe this passage, the numbering of the passage, is very unique, and some of the Hebrew manuscripts have the number 70 instead of the number 50,070. And probably that's the correct answer, that there were 70 men. And it seems much more reasonable that there were 70 men who looked inside the ark. I mean, wouldn't it seem a strange thing if there were people filing past the Ark of the Covenant like the tomb of Lenin, and then they get 5 steps beyond and they drop dead? Don't you think that would cut down the line pretty good? But you can imagine 70 people crowding around to try to see what's in the Ark of the Covenant, and then just like, well, you saw it in Indiana Jones, that kind of thing where they do. I'm not saying it happened like that, but you get what I'm trying to say here. So that's one problem, and I think it's solved just by understanding there was probably an error by a copyist, and some of the Hebrew manuscripts that we do have the correct number 70 instead of 50,070. Going on, 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 7 through 9. Why did God condemn Israel for wanting a king when he seemed to promise and make provision for a king long before in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 20? Now, we talked a little bit about this before. And the idea is simply this. Deuteronomy 17 seems to indicate that God had in mind for Israel to have a king all along. Then, why does it seem that in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when Israel finally asks for a king, God acts like, well, I'm all hurt, you're rejecting me, this isn't good. How do those two go together? Well, I would answer it with what you see up on the screen. There'd be basically 3 reasons. First of all, they wanted a king for the wrong reasons. Secondly, they wanted a king in the wrong timing. And thirdly, they wanted a king in a rebellious manner. In other words, the rebellious manner was an open rejection of God in that. And so they wanted for the wrong reasons to be like the nations. They wanted the wrong timing. God wanted to give them a king later, and they wanted a rebellious manner. Now, let me just give you my personal opinion, and I can't really tell you this for certain, but it's just kind of my opinion. I believe that if Israel would have truly waited on the Lord, God would have given them a king in time, and the first king would have been David. And that way, the work of Israel, the work of the kingdom in Israel would have gotten off to a good start instead of a goofy start with Saul. And so I think that's the big difference. That if they would have been patient and waited on the Lord, they would have gotten a king in time, but the royal line would have started with David instead of having the great disappointment of King Saul in his day. All right, next section, talking about a problem passage in 1 Samuel. We can ask the question, 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 5, how could the Philistines have used 30,000 chariots at Michmash? We have this here in verse 5 where it says, then the Philistines gathered together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people as the sand is which is on the seashore in multitude. People say, well, listen, it's impossible that the Philistines could have had 30,000 chariots. And you know what? I don't know if I'd say it's impossible. I'll certainly say it's unlikely. And again, the answer to the question is simply this. There are reasons to believe that the number was incorrectly copied and should be 3,000 or possibly 1,000. This also suits the number of horsemen mentioned. In other words, when you go through biblical descriptions of battles and troop sizes, there is almost always more horsemen than chariots. But here, the chariots outnumber the horsemen 30,000 to 6,000. It's much more likely that it was 3,000 or possibly 1,000 chariots, and again, the 6,000 horsemen. Which again, friends, you're talking about a massive army, no matter how you slice it. But one thing you got to understand is that errors in numerical copying were much more common before the use of numerals and numbers were written out. What I'm just trying to say is that, understand, in the ancient Hebrew manuscripts, they don't use numerals. You don't have the numeral 1 and the numeral 1. They wrote out numbers. And for some reason, it was just easier to corrupt or to make a bad copy of the citation of these numbers when they were written out in this way, rather than when they used numbers, numerals. Arabic numerals is what we call them later on in time. Okay, next problem passage. How could God be sorry that he set up Saul as king over Israel? 1 Samuel 15, verse 11 reads, I'll read it, verse 10. Now the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set up Saul as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. And you just kind of say, well, man, God, if you're so broken up, why did you appoint him in the first place? You knew I was going to turn out. Look, the answer is simply this. As in many places in the Bible, this passage speaks anthropomorphically. It speaks of God according to the nature of men. Why? Well, so that those who have the nature of men, you and I, so that we can at least partially understand. There's certain things in the aspect and the attributes and the character of God that are frankly beyond us. So all God can do is describe it in the best terms we can understand. And this is just the best way we can understand it, that there was a sense of regret or pain or whatever, or sorrow in God's heart over the appointment. Is it exactly like human sorrow where we regret mistakes and such? Well, no, God doesn't make mistakes. But again, it's analogous to that, and that's why it's recorded that way in the text. It's using that great word, an anthropomorphism. Going on, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 10 and 11. How many sons did Jesse have? 1 Samuel 16 says he had 8 sons, and 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 13 through 15, says he had 7 sons. Well, most people try to solve this difficulty by pointing out that probably Jesse had one son who died without posterity. Apparently, David had an older brother who died without ever being married or having children. And therefore, his name was not listed in the 1 Chronicles chapter 2 number. That seems to be the most reasonable explanation. I don't mean to get too personal with anybody, but you'll encounter people who have had to endure the tragedy of a child dying. And sometimes they don't know how to answer the question, how many children do you have? And sometimes they'll answer the question according to how many children they have on earth. And sometimes they'll answer the question according to how many children they have in heaven and on earth. So it kind of goes along those kind of lines and how this question can be answered. Next, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 19 through 21. Saul recognized David as the son of Jesse, but in 1 Samuel chapter 17, 58, he spoke as if he did not recognize him. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 58, Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." Well, previous to this, at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 16, David is received into Saul's court and becomes a musician for Saul, playing the lyre to help Saul's troubled spirit. He's soothing the savage beast through his music. Well, they had some kind of a relationship at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 16, but at the end of chapter 17, he asks David, Who are you? Whose son are you, young man? And actually, it's not that complicated. Because in 1 Samuel chapter 17, after David killed Goliath, Saul needed to know much more about David, to whom he had promised his daughter in marriage. Saul promised, whoever defeats Goliath is going to get my daughter in marriage. And even though they were introduced before, Saul really didn't know that much about David, especially he didn't know much about his family background. So when you consider that, you go, oh, okay, it makes more sense why he would say to David, whose son are you, young man? Tell me about your family background. Our family is going to be joined in marriage. We need to know this kind of stuff. Next slide. Problem passage in the book of 1 Samuel. You might be saying, wow, there seem to be a lot of problem passages in 1 Samuel. Well, not in particular. Look, it's a book with 31 chapters, so it doesn't surprise us that there's a few issues in it. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 8 through 16. Did Samuel really appear to Saul at the Witch of Endor? Oh, friends, it's such a tasty passage. Saul, in his great rebellion against God, he knows that the end is near. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 28, he goes and he visits a witch, which of course was strictly forbidden. And he disguises himself and he makes himself, unknown to the witch. And she has him to conjure up, I want to know what's going to happen. Well, I'll just read it to you. 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 8. So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes, and he went, and two men went with him. And they came to the woman by night. And he said, please conduct a seance for me and bring up the one I shall name for you. Then the woman said to him, look, you know what Saul has done. He has cut the mediums, and the spirit is from out of the land. Why then do you lay a snare for my life and cause me to die? And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come to you for this thing. Which, by the way, isn't that funny? Swearing by the Lord to go and conduct something that God expressly condemns. It's like taking a vow before Jesus that the illegal drugs I'm about to sell you are of good quality. You know, it's of that kind of weirdness. Anyway. Verse 11. And the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you're Saul. And the king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a spirit ascending out of the earth. And so he said to her, what is his form? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he's covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. Now, the big question that people have about this is, was this really Samuel coming back from the dead? I'll tell you what I believe. I believe it was. I believe it was, first of all, because that's how the text describes it. The text doesn't say it was a fake Samuel. It says that it was Samuel coming back and speaking. Secondly, the witch who conjured him up was so shocked that something actually happened. You know, this witch was mostly interested in, sleight of hand and deceptive tricks and all the rest. No. This, the appearance of Samuel, gave her a reality that she was not used to dealing with. But then third, and perhaps the most important reason, was that God used Samuel to announce the end to Saul. Final judgment. You're going to die tomorrow in battle. This is how it ends for you, Saul. We would hope that Saul used that opportunity to get his life right with God, knowing that his days were few, his hours were few. But there's no indication in the text that he did that at all. So I believe that it actually was Samuel, sent by God actually to do a final last work, sent from the world beyond. Okay, next and finally, this is our last slide and our last issue of the problem passage. 1 Samuel chapter 31, did Saul kill himself or did the Amalekite kill him? Now what do we mean by this? Well, in 2 Samuel chapter 1, an Amalekite comes to David, who survived, of course. He didn't die in this battle. An Amalekite comes to David with Saul's crown and with some of Saul's royal bracelets. And he said, I just killed King Saul, your enemy. Well, he expected David to be delighted because Saul was indeed his enemy. But David was not delighted because David knew that, number one, as wicked as Saul was, he was the Lord's anointed. Number two, David was not in favor of anybody killing kings. He was about to become the king of Israel. He didn't want to set the precedent that it was a good thing to kill a king of Israel. So what did David do? Well, hold on with that. The story in 1 Samuel is that Saul attempted to kill himself, and he fell on his sword and died. It is possible that Saul did not finish himself off, but he was still alive when the Amalekite came upon him. And the Amalekite finished him. That's entirely plausible. It's also plausible that the Amalekites simply came upon the dead body of Saul and thought that by taking his crown and his bracelets, he could come to David and get riches and honor for being the one who killed King Saul. No matter which one was true, whether the Amalekite actually finished King Saul off or whether he was just the first one to come upon his dead body, it did not end well with the Amalekite, because David said, well, you've condemned yourself. You told me you killed King Saul. Off with your head. And they slayed the Amalekite. So that's easily solved there. There's really no necessary contradiction between the passages. Anyway, that'll wrap it up for a time taking a look through this exciting, really, it's a thrilling book, 1 Samuel. I hope you enjoyed doing your reading through the book. I hope you found it profitable, and get ready for 2 Samuel next week. I think you'll find that to be a very profitable book as well. Father, we pray for your blessing. I pray that you bless these students. I thank you for their forbearance, for them allowing me to teach them over video. But Lord, we believe that you can use that as well. And so we just pray for your blessing upon them and a blessing upon the class at the Bible College this semester. In Jesus' name, amen. Bye-bye. And next week, 2 Samuel.